The Hebrew Bible gives Samael no name. He is not there. The serpent of Eden is a serpent. The adversary of Job is a title, not a person. The figure who becomes, in Jewish mystical tradition, the angel of death, the ruler of the demonic world, and the cosmic consort of Lilith. That figure has no canonical verse, the way Lilith has Isaiah 34:14. He is built entirely from what the tradition around the Canon produced. And yet, by the time medieval Kabbalah reaches its fullest expression, Samael and Lilith are drawn into the left side structure of that tradition. A mirror world that inverts and shadows every structure of the divine emanation above it. The question is how a figure with no canonical foundation acquired a position at the left side of the divine structure, and what he needed Lilith to complete it. By the end of this video, you will understand Samael's full textual biography, where he appears, what roles he occupies, how the tradition built him from fragments across centuries of post-biblical Jewish literature. You will understand the Kabbalistic cosmological framework, the Sefirot, the Qliphoth, the left side shadow structure. That gave the Lilith-Samael pairing its theological intelligibility. You will understand why medieval Kabbalah paired them specifically, what problem that pairing solved, and what the partnership between the angel of death and the first wife of Adam reveals about a theology that located evil not outside the divine order but inside it, as its own necessary shadow. This matters because the Lilith-Samael pairing is the tradition's most systematic answer to a question theology has never fully resolved. Where does evil come from if God made everything? The Kabbalistic answer is not that evil is external to God. That answer compromises divine sovereignty. The answer is that evil is the shadow the divine order casts when it emanates into a finite world. Samael and Lilith are not the enemies of the divine structure. They are its negative image. That answer is either the most sophisticated theodicy the medieval world produced, or the most dangerous. Because a God whose own structure generates the conditions for evil is not the God the tradition officially describes. Medieval Kabbalistic literature does something remarkable with the figures it inherited. A demonic male, built from fragments of death, accusation, and the serpent, and a demonic female built from night, sexuality, and infant danger. It joins them as a cosmic pair, places them within the left side structure of the cosmos, not outside creation, inside its shadow. What that pairing says about the structure of evil and about the structure of God is what this episode is about. Hold that. Samael does not appear in the Hebrew Bible. He is constructed entirely from the tradition around the Canon. From fragments of post-biblical Jewish literature, from the pseudepigrapha, from Talmudic and midrashic sources, and ultimately from the Kabbalistic systematization that gave him his final form. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly how that construction happened, and why a figure built from fragments became more theologically consequential than most figures the Canon names directly. The name itself carries the difficulty. Lilith-Samael, two competing etymologies, neither certain, both theologically significant. The first derivation reads Sam as the Hebrew word for poison or venom. The poison of God, the venom of God. The second reads it as a variant of sin or blindness. The blindness of God, or the one who blinds toward God. Neither reading places the danger outside the divine. In both etymologies, the name encodes something operating within the structure of the divine rather than against it from the outside. That encoding is not accidental. It is the grammatical template for everything the figure will become. Samael's earliest appearances come not from Scripture, but from the literature that grew alongside Scripture. In the pseudepigraphical tradition, he occupies territory adjacent to, but distinct from the Watcher tradition the audience holds from the Semyaza episode. The Watchers of First Enoch are fallen angels who descend to earth and corrupt humanity through physical transgression. Samael's transgression operates in a different register. In the Adam and Eve pseudepigraphic tradition, the serpent of Eden becomes increasingly linked with a suprahuman adversarial agent. Some later Jewish versions and related traditions identify that agent with Samael. Working through the serpent, operating as the tempter of Eve. Other recensions speak more generally of Satan or the devil. The Samael identification is not a single clean first-century source, but a pattern of increasing specificity across post-biblical Jewish literature, with Samael emerging as the preferred name in distinctly Jewish retellings. The Talmudic and midrashic tradition develops a second, structurally distinct role. The Babylonian Talmud, Bava Batra 16a, makes a statement that becomes foundational. Satan, the evil inclination, and the angel of death are one. Three functions, one identity. But the passage does not name that identity Samael. The identification of Samael with this cluster comes in later midrashic and mystical traditions, where Samael is progressively attached to the roles the Talmud has already drawn together. He does not enter the Talmud under his own name in this role. He enters through the later tradition's reading of what the Talmud had prepared, when later midrashic sources name him as the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. They are not contradicting earlier tradition. They are completing it, giving a name to the figure the Talmud's identification had left nameless. That placement matters structurally. The angel of death in rabbinic thought is not a rebel figure. He is a divine functionary, an executor of divine judgment, an administrator of death, operating under divine authority. His work is institutional rather than oppositional. This is why the Kabbalistic architecture will eventually draw Samael into the left side structure as an interior figure rather than an external adversary. The functional role that midrashic tradition gave him carries exactly the institutional, interior to the system character that the Qliphoth cosmology makes use of. The serpent identification develops in parallel. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, in its extant form a late and complex targumic text whose precise dating remains contested, makes the identification between Samael and the serpent of Eden explicit. It is useful evidence for the trajectory of the tradition, but not a witness to the earliest rabbinic consensus. What it documents is where the tradition was heading: Samael as the adversarial power behind the serpent of Eden, the origin of human sin given a specific name, in several midrashim, including Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. The identification becomes elaborated. Samael descends upon the serpent, rides it, operates through it. The Eden transgression is Samael's transgression. One important and influential reading of the serpent's role in rabbinic literature, not the only reading, but one that became theologically consequential. The adversarial role develops across midrashic and mystical literature, where Samael is identified as the prince of the demonic realm, the accuser, the cosmic opponent of Israel, the territory he shares with the adversarial tradition the Lucifer playlist developed. The Satan as office, examined there as a title and function before it became a figure, is real. Samael is the closest the Jewish tradition comes to giving that function a full personal biography. But the identification between Samael and the Satan/adversarial tradition is partial, not complete. Samael retains his angel of death function within the divine administration, in a way that the Christian Satan's rebellion theology does not accommodate. Devarim Rabbah explicitly identifies Samael as the Prince of Rome and as the accuser. The two figures share territory. They are not the same figure, three functions, no canonical anchor, a figure the tradition needed across three distinct theological registers: sin's origin, death's administration, cosmic opposition, but never authorized in a single canonical text. By the time medieval Kabbalah encountered this accumulated figure, it had precisely the functional profile the left side structure could put to work. An entity that is simultaneously interior to the divine order and responsible for its demonic underside. What the cosmological architecture that eventually placed him alongside Lilith in the left side imagination of medieval Kabbalah looks like, and why it needed both of them, requires understanding the structure itself. The Kabbalistic cosmological system is not a mythology. It is a rigorous theological architecture in which every element has a precise structural position and a precise functional role. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the Sefirot and the Qliphoth well enough to understand why the Lilith-Samael pairing is not a demonological detail, but a cosmological argument, one whose internal logic made a structured demonic governance theologically intelligible. The starting point is Ein Sof, the infinite, the limitless, the divine as it is in itself, prior to any act of creation or expression. Ein Sof cannot be spoken about directly in the Kabbalistic system. It is not a person, not a presence with attributes, not a God who acts or speaks in the biblical sense. It is the infinite ground from which the divine emanates into finite expression. That emanation produces the Sefirot, 10 distinct modes of divine expression, each with a specific name, a specific function, a specific position in the overall architecture. They are not gods. They are not separate beings. They are the 10 structural positions through which Ein Sof becomes accessible to a finite world. Keter, the crown, is the highest Sephirah, closest to Ein Sof, the first movement of divine expression into form. Below it, Chokmah, divine wisdom, and Binah, divine understanding. These three form the uppermost triad. Below them, 6 middot, operative divine qualities: chesed, loving kindness; gevurah, severity or strength; Tiferet, harmony, the heart of the tree; Netzach, endurance; Hod, splendor; Yesod, foundation. And at the base of the tree, Malkuth, the kingdom, the Sephirah, at which divine emanation reaches the material world. Malkuth is associated with the Shekinah, the divine presence, the feminine dimension of God, the indwelling of the divine in the created world. That association is important for what follows. The problem the Sefirot immediately generates is a theodicy problem. If everything that exists is a product of divine emanation, where does evil come from? The Kabbalistic tradition does not accept the privation answer common to mainstream medieval theology. The argument that evil is simply the absence of good, a non-being requiring no explanation. If the divine order produces a finite world through emanation, then the edges of that process, the places where the divine light thins and withdraws, produce something. That something is what the Kabbalistic tradition calls the Qliphoth. Qliphoth, plural of Qlipha, literally shells or husks, are the concept the Zohar introduces as the demonic or impure dimension of reality. The Zohar develops an image of shells and left side forces that stand in contrast to the divine emanations. A realm of impurity associated with the left side of the cosmic structure. The Zohar provides the foundational language for this: shells, left side forces, demonic emanation generated at the margins of the divine order's own activity. The fully mapped shadow tree, in which 10 Qliphoth precisely correspond to the 10 Sefirot in a numbered mirroring scheme, is a later development, increasingly systematized in post-Zoharic Kabbalistic tradition, and more elaborately mapped in early modern and later esoteric synthesis. The Zohar seeds the framework. Later tradition builds the diagram on it. That framework, however, creates a theological space that later tradition found productive. If evil is not external chaos, but the shadow of divine emanation, structured, persistent, operating according to its own internal logic, then it becomes theologically useful to imagine it as having governance, a cosmos ordered by divine emanation at every level, in which divine presences are associated with the Sefirot, creates a conceptual place for equivalent figures on the left side. The question that the Zohar and subsequent Kabbalistic tradition confronts is not whether the demonic realm has rulers, but which figures the tradition will place there and why. The divine pairing model is part of what makes a demonic pair theologically useful. Kabbalistic theology is deeply attentive to the pairing of masculine and feminine energies across the Sefirot. The divine masculine and the Shekinah, God and his indwelling presence. The pairing at the base of the tree of life in Malkuth. If the left side demonic structure mirrors the divine structure, then at its base, a demonic pairing can occupy the equivalent position. An inversion of the divine feminine presence and an inversion of the divine masculine force paired with her. The structure creates a place where a demonic pair can do important theological work. Before any figures are named, the logic of the system has already determined the shape of the governance it can accommodate. The left side demonic structure has now been shown to make a governing pair theologically intelligible. What the Zohar and the texts immediately surrounding it determined, with a specificity that was not accidental, is which figures filled those positions. And why those particular figures were selected is not a question the cosmological system alone can answer. It requires knowing what each figure brought to the position from their prior history. The Zohar, compiled in 13th century Spain and attributed to the 2nd century sage Shimon bar Yochai, is the foundational text of medieval Kabbalah and the primary source for the left side cosmological architecture within which Lilith and Samael are paired. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the textual history of that pairing, including the important pre-Zoharic source that the Zohar built upon, what theological work their union was made to do, and why the most consequential demonological architecture in the Jewish mystical tradition was also its most radical theodicy. Before that argument is made, the most straightforward objection deserves its full force. The pairing of Lilith and Samael is, on one reading, a medieval synthesis. Two pre-existing demonic figures conveniently joined for narrative and literary purposes. In texts that are, on careful examination, sophisticated religious literature as much as systematic theology. Gershom Scholem, whose work in On the Kabbalah and its symbolism in Kabbalah established the field's modern scholarly foundations, was careful about the degree to which Kabbalistic mythology should be read as systematic theology, rather than as mystical literature with its own poetic and imaginative logic. Moshe Idel, in Kabbalah, New Perspectives, further complicates Scholem's framework by emphasizing the diversity of Kabbalistic traditions and the danger of reading any single text's constructions as representing a unified system. The pairing may be a creative act of synthesis. It may not be what the system structurally required. That objection is partially correct and ultimately insufficient. What it misses is that the specific figures selected, Lilith, whose prior tradition included infant harm, nocturnal intrusion, and the amulet contractual logic developed in Episode 1. Samael, whose prior tradition included the accumulated functions of death administration, serpent identification, and cosmic adversarial role, are not random selections from a pool of available demonic figures. Each brings a specific functional profile that fills the left side governance position with a precision unavailable to any other figure in the tradition. Together they supply the two halves the tradition needed. Samael carried death, accusation, and the serpent. Cosmic adversarial power at the level of sin's origin and death's governance. Lilith carried night sexuality, infant danger, and demonic femininity. Domestic and reproductive demonic power at the threshold between the divine immanent order and its shadow. Medieval Kabbalah joined them into a left side pair not because they had always belonged together, but because together they gave evil a structure the tradition had not previously managed to give it. The textual history of the pairing is important and often overlooked. Before the Zohar, the treatise on the left emanation, a 13th century Kabbalistic text whose importance the scholar Joseph Dan has carefully documented, provides one of the earliest systematic formulations of Samael and Lilith as a demonic pair. Dan notes that this is the first dated Jewish work in which Samael and Lilith appear explicitly as husband and wife within the realm of evil. The treatise on the left emanation operates within the same 13th century flowering of early Kabbalistic speculation in Provence and Spain that produced the Zohar. The Zohar then gives this left-side demonological pairing its most influential and most widely transmitted mystical form. The treatise on the left emanation and the Zoharic tradition placed Lilith and Samael within overlapping left-side cosmologies. Zoharic passages position Lilith within the left-side structure as an inversion of the holy feminine presence. Later, Kabbalistic readers and systematizers understand her as the dark counterpart to the Shekinah, the demonic inversion of the divine feminine presence at the base of the Sefirot. Samael occupies the shadow of the divine masculine, the left side force that inverts the right side divine flow. His serpent identification, developed in the earlier tradition, is woven into the Zohar's treatment of the Eden narrative as a cosmological event rather than simply a historical one. The left side Kabbalistic tradition, including the treatise on the left emanation and the Zoharic material, contains something the structural argument alone does not anticipate: a demonic pair, a dark counterpart to sacred union. In these texts, the union of Samael and Lilith is described in terms that deliberately mirror the sacred pairing above. The demonic consort relationship modeled on, and inverting, the divine masculine-feminine pairing at the heart of the Sefirot. Some left-side traditions describe aspects of their conjoined form using serpent and dragon imagery. The figure of Tananiver, the blind dragon, appears in some of these texts in connection with their union. The demonic pairing becomes the dark counterpart to the divine pairing, drawn into the left side structure of the cosmos, not placed outside it. Their position is not outside the divine structure, it is the shadow of it. Evil given a governing pair means evil given structural intelligibility. The same formal coherence as the Sefirot it inverts. That is what medieval Kabbalah accomplished by placing Samael and Lilith together. The Kabbalistic tradition's response to the theodicy problem. Where does evil come from if God made everything? Is not that evil is absent or accidental. It is that the conditions for evil arise within the divine order's own structure, and that the demonic realm they produce is as precisely organized as the Sefirot it mirrors, administered by figures whose specific functional profiles make them not interchangeable with any other candidates in the tradition. What the first 3 chapters have assembled is not a demonology survey, and not a biography of 2 demonic figures. It is the evidence base for a single specific claim, that the Lilith-Samael pairing is the Kabbalistic tradition's answer to the theodicy problem, and that the answer it gives is historically traceable, structurally coherent, and theologically radical. The second half of this video asks what that answer costs. What a theology that places the conditions for evil inside the divine structure, rather than outside it implies about the divine structure itself, and why the tradition eventually curtailed the answer before it reached its logical conclusion. The treatise on the left emanation and the Zoharic tradition placed Lilith and Samael within overlapping left-side cosmologies. What they did not fully develop is what those positions imply dynamically. What Lilith and Samael actually govern, what their world consists of, and what happens when the Qliphoth is understood not as a static framework, but as a living realm. That development belongs to the Lurianic school, and its implications are considerably more unsettling than anything the earlier Kabbalistic tradition produced. The Qliphoth in Zoharic Kabbalah is a conceptual framework. The language of shells, left-side forces, and structured demonic reality in the post-Zoharic Kabbalistic tradition, particularly in the work of Isaac Luria and the Lurianic school of 16th century Saft. That framework deepens into a more dynamic account of brokenness, impurity, and repair, in which the Qliphothic realm acquires an internal structure, a population, and a cosmic function that the earlier tradition had not fully developed. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what Lilith and Samael's domain consists of in the Lurianic system, what those developments add to the earlier Kabbalistic framework, and why the Qliphoth is not the Kabbalistic equivalent of hell, but something theologically stranger. Isaac Luria, working in 16th century Saft in the Galilee, with a circle of students whose most systematic recorder was Chaim Vital, produced the most comprehensive Kabbalistic cosmology the tradition has generated, Vital's Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life. Preserves Luria's teachings in a form that became the primary reference for post-Zoharic Kabbalistic thought. 3 Lurianic concepts deepen the Qliphothic problem, turning the Zohar's left-side language into a more dynamic account of what the demonic realm is, where it came from, and what its relationship to the divine order ultimately implies. The first is Tzimtzum, the divine self-contraction. Before creation, the divine was everywhere and everything. For a finite world to exist, space had to be made, and the only space available was within the infinite divine. Tzimtzum is the act by which Ein Sof contracted into itself, withdrawing the divine light from a primordial space to allow the created world to exist. This withdrawal is not a failure or a diminishment. It is the structural precondition for a finite world. But the act of contraction produces a consequence. The space from which the divine light withdrew is a space of relative divine absence. The Qliphothic forces, the shells and left-side structures the Zohar described, become, in the Lurianic account, the structural product of the act that made creation possible. The conditions for the demonic realm arise within the divine act of creation itself. The second concept is Shevarat ha-Kelim, the shattering of the vessels. In the early stages of the Lurianic creation narrative, the divine light emanating into the newly created space was too intense for the vessels created to contain it. The vessels shattered, the shards fell, and within those shards, within the broken fragments of the vessels meant to contain the divine light, fragments of the divine light itself became trapped. The Qliphothic realm now contains something unexpected. It contains holiness, not holiness expressed or operative, but holiness trapped, awaiting recovery. The demonic world is not simply the absence of divine light. It is the prison of divine light that could not be contained. The third concept is tikkun, cosmic repair. The human project in the Lurianic system is the recovery of those trapped divine sparks, elevating them back toward their source through mitzvot, prayer, and proper religious intention. In mainstream Lurianic practice, this is not accomplished through deliberate descent into evil or engagement with demonic forces. The sparks are elevated through acts of holiness. Through the proper conduct of a religious life, aligned with divine will. The Qliphothic realm is not to be sought out or entered. It is to be diminished by drawing the divine light within it upward through prayer and the fulfillment of commandments. Later, Kabbalistic mappings often associate Lilith with the lowest demonic position, corresponding to the shadow of Malkuth. The left side inversion of the Shekinah's position at the base of the divine tree. And Samael, with destructive severity and the left side, linked to the Qliphothic shadow of Gevurah. These mappings are not uniform across all Kabbalistic sources. They represent one influential strand of later systematization rather than a single authoritative scheme. What they express across their variation is a consistent principle. Lilith governs the dimension of the demonic world closest to the human domestic sphere, the threshold between divine immanence in the created world and its demonic inversion. Samael governs the dimension of cosmic severity, judgment operating without mercy. The death administrative function elevated to cosmic adversarial governance. Their demonic offspring, the Lilim, whose origins in the amulet contractual tradition belong fully to episode 1. Lilith, the woman before Eve, that tradition could not bury, become in the Lurianic framework the inhabitants of a structured demonic world, rather than simply the consequence of a biographical exile. Their existence gives the Qliphoth not just structure but population. A world with lineages and reproductive logic, administered by governors whose functional profiles precisely fit the positions they occupy. The Lurianic system has made the conditions for evil inseparable from the divine order's own creative act, not outside creation, the product of creation's own generative logic. Lilith and Samael do not rule a realm that exists in opposition to God's design. They rule a realm that God's own design produced. The implication of that claim, for the tradition's understanding of divine sovereignty, for the centuries of protective amulets and rabbinic warnings for the entire apparatus, the tradition built to manage the demonic world, has not yet been stated. It is the most consequential implication the Kabbalistic tradition produced, and it is the reason the tradition eventually pulled back from this theology rather than taking it to its conclusion. The Lilith-Samael cosmology is the Kabbalistic tradition's most direct engagement with the theodicy problem. Where does evil come from if God made everything? By the end of this chapter, you will understand why. The answer it offers is simultaneously the most sophisticated and the most theologically consequential position the tradition produced, and why it was eventually curtailed rather than extended to its logical conclusion. The theodicy problem has three available structural answers. The first, evil is external to God, a force or being independent of the divine that creates corruption in the created world. This answer compromises divine omnipotence. If evil is genuinely external to God, then God did not make everything. The second, evil is the absence of good. Not a positive reality, but a privation, a deficit of being rather than a being in its own right. This is mainstream medieval theology's answer, in both its Christian and Jewish forms. It handles the problem formally, but at the cost of explaining away rather than explaining. The third, the conditions for evil arise within the divine act of creation itself. At the structural margins of divine emanation into a finite world, as the shadow the divine order casts when it moves from infinite into finite. Not outside God's sovereignty, not beyond God's creative act, within its own structural logic. The Kabbalistic answer is the third, and the Lurianic development makes its implications unavoidable. If Tzimtzum, the divine self-contraction, is the structural precondition for creation, then the divine itself generated the conditions for the Qliphothic realm by the act that made creation possible. If Shevirat ha-Kelim, the shattering of the vessels, is an event within the divine plan rather than a disaster happening to it, then the divine sparks, trapped in the Qliphothic shards, are there within the structure of divine intention, not despite it. Lilith and Samael do not rule a realm that corrupted what God made. They rule a realm that the act of making produced. The centuries of amulets, the exorcisms, the Talmudic warnings, the names written on walls. The tradition spent centuries managing Lilith as an external threat. The Kabbalistic answer is that the threat was never external. The conditions for evil are the divine order's own structural consequence. The Qliphoth is not what the divine failed to prevent. It is what the divine structure itself generated in the act of creation. Samael and Lilith within the left side structure are not evidence of the divine order's vulnerability to corruption. They are evidence of the divine order's own self-completion. The shadow that the divine order casts, as precisely structured as the light that casts it. The partial identification between Samael and the Western Lucifer/Satan tradition, examined in the Lucifer playlist as an adversarial office and function before it became a figure, finds its most personal form here. Samael is the closest the Jewish tradition comes to a fully biographical, adversarial figure, an entity with a name, a history, a cosmological position, and a consort. The territory Samael shares with the Christian Satan is real, the serpent of Eden, the adversarial function, the cosmic opposition to the divine. What separates them is precisely this. The Christian Satan is a rebel, exterior to the divine order, fallen from it. Samael is interior to it. He is not fallen from the divine structure. He is the left side of it. That distinction is the clearest expression of the difference between the Christian and Kabbalistic accounts of evil. Why did the tradition curtail this theology rather than develop it? The Sabbatean movement of the 17th century, centered on the messianic claimant Sabbatai Zevi, radicalized one possible reading of Lurianic repair. If sparks are trapped in the realm of impurity, then deliberate descent into impurity could be reimagined by some followers as a redemptive act, forcing the release of divine sparks through transgression. This was not mainstream Lurianism. It was a dangerous antinomian mutation of it, one that drew on the emotional force of the Lurianic theodicy while radicalizing it beyond anything the tradition's architects intended. The catastrophic collapse of the Sabbatean movement prompted a sharp retrenchment in mainstream Kabbalistic tradition. The Qliphothic theology was not abandoned, but its most radical implications were contained. The legacy of the Kabbalistic answer to the theodicy problem. The theology that placed the conditions for evil inside the divine creative act rather than outside it, did not disappear with the Sabbatean retrenchment. It entered the Western esoteric tradition through channels that preserved its structure, even when they stripped its theological precision. That transmission is the subject of the final chapter. The Lilith-Samael pairing did not remain confined to medieval Kabbalistic texts. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the specific channels through which the cosmology built around that pairing entered Western esoteric tradition, shaped later demonology, and generated the modern cultural reception of both figures, and why that reception preserves recognizable traces of the original theology even when it has forgotten the theology itself. The first channel is Christian Kabbalah, Renaissance humanists. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, in his Conclusiones of 1486, Johannes Reuchlin, in De Arte Kabbalistica of 1517. Engaged directly with Kabbalistic texts and with the left-side structures they described. Their engagement was selective and substantially transformed by the requirements of Christian theological frameworks, elements of Kabbalistic demonology, names, hierarchies, and left-side structures, became available to Christian and later esoteric readers through this transmission, though not always with their original Kabbalistic precision intact. The Lilith-Samael pairing was one strand in that wider transmission, carried forward in recognizable but altered form. Early modern grimoires. Demonological catalogs including the Ars Goetia and related texts in the Lesser Key of Solomon preserve demonic names and attributes from multiple sources, including Kabbalistic transmission. They do not, however, preserve the Zoharic and Lurianic architecture intact. The structural logic of the left-side shadow structure the theodicy argument, the precise mirroring of divine governance. None of this survives the grimoire transmission cleanly. Lilith and Samael enter later Western esoteric reception through multiple channels, not one clean line of transmission. The figures survive in various forms. The theology that gave them their structural significance largely does not. The 19th and 20th century esoteric revival, the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn, and subsequent Western esoteric currents, re-engaged with Kabbalistic primary sources more directly. Scholars like Gershom Scholem, whose academic work made the Kabbalistic primary sources accessible to non-specialist readers in the mid-20th century, were read by practitioners as well as academics. The modern esoteric reception of Lilith and Samael sits closer to the original theological argument than the grimoire tradition's decontextualized inheritance. Because the revivalists, in many cases, worked from the Zohar and related texts, rather than simply from the demonological catalogs that had filtered them, the feminist recuperation of Lilith in the 20th century draws primarily on the first wife narrative fully developed in Episode 1, but the Kabbalistic Lilith. The left side governing presence, the dark counterpart to the Shekinah, the figure whose position in the demonic structure mirrors the divine feminine presence she inverts, is a more complicated symbol for that recuperation than the feminist tradition usually acknowledges. A figure who is structurally useful to the Kabbalistic architecture of evil is not simply a suppressed alternative to patriarchal theology. She is the tradition's own most sophisticated theological production in the domain of the demonic, assigned the most structurally precise and cosmologically consequential role the tradition could give her. The series arc closes here. Isaiah gave her one word. Babylon gave her a diagnostic and ritual medical profile. Exile gave her a Hebrew name and a Talmudic warning. The alphabet gave her a biography. The Zohar and the texts surrounding it gave her a throne. The Lurianic school gave her a world. The trajectory from the single word in Isaiah to the left side governance of the demonic structure is the trajectory from a figure the tradition could not explain to a figure the tradition could not structurally complete itself without. Future episodes in this playlist will continue to trace the pattern of suppressed feminine theological figures. The Asherah, whose relationship to the Shekinah, the canonical text set aside. The woman clothed with the sun in Revelation 12, where the Kabbalistic feminine divine tradition meets the apocalyptic. But the arc that began with Lilith ends here, at the throne the tradition built for her, and beside her the figure it built to share it. Samael. No canonical verse, no biblical anchor. Built across centuries of post-biblical Jewish tradition from three accumulated functional roles: the cluster of Satan, evil inclination, and death administrator that Bava Batra 16a drew together. Named Samael by the midrashic and mystical tradition that completed the identification. The serpent of Eden, increasingly specified as Samael in the Jewish retellings. The cosmic adversary, given a biography the adversarial tradition had only sketched. The largest and most complete figure the Jewish mystical tradition produced. for an entity it never officially authorized. The Sefirot and the Qliphoth, 10 divine emanations and their left side shadow. The tree of life and the structured demonic realm the Zohar called the realm of shells, not mythology and its dark mirror, theology and its own internal consequence. The conditions for evil arising within the divine order's own emanative act. The left side demonic structure made theologically intelligible, not externally imposed, but generated by the same logic as the Sefirot it inverts, and requiring a governing pair, because the divine pairing of God and Shekinah at the base of the tree of life makes a structural counterpart at the base of its shadow theologically useful, the pairing. Lilith and Samael as the demonic couple medieval Kabbalah needed, each carrying a different half of the tradition's evil, together supplying the two halves the structure made room for. The treatise on the left emanation, as the first dated Jewish work to name them as husband and wife. The Zohar as the text that gave the pairing its most influential cosmological form, evil given structural coherence. The theodicy problem not solved but answered, not that evil is absent or external or accidental, but that the conditions for evil arise within the divine order's own creative act, and that the demonic realm those conditions produce is as precisely organized as the Sefirot it inverts. The Lurianic development, Tzimtzum, the divine self-contraction that made space for creation, and produced structurally the conditions for the Qliphothic realm, Shevirat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels, the divine sparks trapped within the broken shards, holiness imprisoned within the demonic world. Tikkun, the cosmic repair project, conducted through mitzvot, prayer, and intention. That makes the Qliphothic realm not simply an adversary to be avoided, but a domain from which divine light must be recovered through a properly conducted religious life. Lilith and Samael as administrators of a world whose divine contents must be elevated through holiness, not through dissent. The theodicy answer. The conditions for evil as the structural consequence of divine emanation. The most radical theological position the Jewish mystical tradition produced on the origin of evil. The tradition that had spent centuries managing Lilith as an external threat, discovering in the Qliphothic cosmology that the conditions for the threat were the divine structure's own product, curtailed by the Sabbatean catastrophe. Not as the logical conclusion of Lurianism, but as its dangerous antinomian mutation. Surviving in the esoteric tradition, the mainstream could not entirely absorb and could not entirely discard the trajectory. From one word in Isaiah to a throne at the left side of the divine structure. From a Babylonian ritual medical category to a Kabbalistic queen. From a figure the tradition tried to contain to a figure the tradition could not structurally complete itself without. The tradition that began by refusing to explain the Lilith of Isaiah 34, ended by giving her a throne in the structure of the divine itself. That is not a failure of containment. That is what happens when a tradition takes its own internal logic seriously enough to follow it to its conclusion. Samael arrived at the same throne from the other direction, built from nothing, from fragments, from the accumulated weight of every role the tradition needed an adversarial figure to fill. The angel of death, the serpent of Eden, the cosmic adversary. Each role added without a canonical anchor, each role making the figure more necessary rather than less. And eventually, in the Kabbalistic system, the tradition discovered that the figure it had been building for centuries was exactly the figure it needed to complete the cosmological picture. The left side ruler of the demonic world that the divine world's own structure had produced. The Lilith-Samael pairing is the tradition's acknowledgement that the question it had been managing since Isaiah was not the question it thought it was. The question was not, who is this creature in the desert? The question was, if God made everything, what made evil? And the answer the tradition eventually produced. Not officially, not canonically, but in the mystical literature that runs alongside the official tradition, like a shadow alongside a wall, is that the conditions for evil arise within the act of creation itself, not outside divine sovereignty, not in the action of a rebel, in the structural logic of divine emanation into a finite world. The Qliphoth are not God's mistake, they are God's shadow. Lilith sits at the left side of that shadow. She has been there, in various forms, since Babylon. The tradition spent 2,000 years trying to explain why she was dangerous. Medieval Kabbalah finally showed why she could become necessary. That admission did not resolve the question. It deepened it.